So, welcome everybody. I'm Kyle, and this is the Storybook MCP kind of Ask Me Anything session. Before we get to that part, we're still going to do like a quick presentation and a demo, um, but we'll do questions throughout. And with me, I have two members of the Storybook team. Would you two like to introduce yourself? Maybe starting with Yappa.
Sure. I'm part of the core team. I've been so for 3 years, and I live in Denmark. And I have been leading most of the technical parts of our MCP work from zero to today.
Yeah, my name is Valentin. I joined the Storybook team 3 years ago. I'm also in the core team, mainly responsible for builder parts, Next.js integrations, stuff like that. Yeah.
Great. Thank you both for being here.
Mhm.
So, yeah, let me just share a little bit about what we built in terms of kind of the problem we're solving. So, our goal is we wanted agents to reuse the components that you already had. Um, and we realized that Storybook is an excellent store of those components and their metadata, such as the props they receive. Stories serve as usage examples. Any documentation you have in there, that's all really useful context for an agent to have. And so we built up the Storybook MCP server to provide the agents information about the components that you have in your Storybook. So that's where we started, is just reusing the components that already exist as you build your UI. But we realized we could and we should do more. And so how far the agents can go as you're generating UI depends on your system's structure, your design system structure. And that structure breaks down into two concepts. There's coverage and there's validation. So first, coverage. The coverage tells the agents what to reuse. So like I said, the stories serve as canonical examples. Um, we have kind of like a docgen workflow that pulls or extracts information about the props and the types of the component. The documentation you've added is certainly useful to the agent. And then those stories serve as test coverage as well. Um, and so all of that tells the agent what to reuse. And when there's missing patterns or missing metadata, that's when the agents improvise. So the more that we can provide that information, the better. And so we take all that information, we transform it for machine readability. That's what the Storybook MCP does, part of what it does. And then the agents then use that information. That's really important. That optimization step is important because it reduces token usage and it increases speed. Um, and so we have context and then we have validation. That tells the agents what to respect as it's doing the work. And so we've got functional tests or interaction tests, accessibility tests, visual verification, and human sign off. All those tests have to pass, the human has to sign it off, and then we have shippable UI. So the agent generates the code, it runs the tests, then we're good to go. And you need both. You need the coverage and the validation. And so that's what we're providing with Storybook MCP. It provides those things to the agent so that it'll both be able to generate the UI from a good starting point, meaning your components. It'll be able to validate that UI, and then it'll be able to preview the UI to you, the UI user, so that you can provide some human input or validation as necessary at the end. So that's really all I wanted to cover with the deck here. I want to jump into the demo now. So let me get out of this, and then I will open up. Okay, so we've got. Um, oh, and I'm sorry, I forgot to mention. If you want to, you can ask questions using the Q&A widget that Zoom provides, and that'll allow us to manage those questions better and make sure that they get answered. Chat is also fine as well.
And you don't have to wait. You're going to ask whenever you like. This whole thing is an ask me
Yes.
anything question thing, right? So
Yes, absolutely. Please just ask around. Sounds like there might have been an echo. Are we okay now? I can move the monitor, the mic closer, maybe.
it's only for some users, so we don't know why.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's using the right mic. Okay. All right. Let me know if it gets unbearable and we'll look into it. Okay, so I've got a my meal drop app here running in Storybook, and so I've got it separated. So I've got the pages of the app in my locally running Storybook here, and then I'm using a feature called composition to kind of embed another Storybook inside of this one. And so this is my design system for the app. And so I've got my more like um, atomic components like buttons and badges and stuff in here. And the way this works is it's actually hosted. Yeah, I'll just open it up here. So I've got this hosted on Chromatic. And so that's how that is embedded in here. And the reason why I'm showing that is because the MCP server will respect that composition. So when it looks up information about components, it's not just going to look up the local storybook, it's going to also look up all of these published components as well. And it'll combine them all into the result that the agent reads. So you don't have to worry about stitching that together, and you just have to configure one single MCP server. Actually, let me just show that real quick. So if I just run MCP, so we've got the mail drop app SV MCP server connected. So just want to show that. And then now I'll run my prompt. So I have developed a plan to add some order scheduling UI. So let me show you maybe. So on the checkout page, there's no point in which you can choose to like have your meal delivered now or like at a later time. And so I want to add some UI for exactly that. So that's what this plan does. So I'm going to start kicking that off. And I'm using Claude Code here, but this works with any agent that works with an MCP server. Some of the specific abilities are different depending on the agents, but the core workflow works the same for all of them. All right. And while this is kicking off, um, all right, Adam has a question about best practices for defining or formatting metadata for components. Yes, there are. So let me pull up our docs. So we've got a whole docs page on best practices, which I will just go ahead and share in the chat. But it basically boils down to use stories should demonstrate one single concept, not multiple concepts. And then you should use these summaries. And that's just a really efficient way to tell the agent what a particular story is used to explain. Okay. Yes, allow all edits. Did not realize I was in plan mode. Apologies. Okay. So Siva is asking, can you hook into multiple chromatic instances? So I showed our storybook is composing another storybook on that's published on Chromatic. Yes, you can compose as many storybooks as you wish, and MCP will pick up all of them and combine them.
Lucas asks a related question. Does it have to be remote hosted storybooks, or can you stitch together local ones? And you can stitch together local ones. They just
Yes.
have to be running.
Yep.
Otherwise, it won't work, of course. It's
Yeah,
all
I
part
will
of the
say,
storybook.
so part of what the MCP server does, which I don't know, it might have already happened and I missed it. Yeah. So here's our first call to the MCP server tools, where it's asking for storybook story instructions. So it'll teach the agent how to be an expert storybook author, basically. Um, That, if you're running multiple storybooks, that can get a little confusing for the agent on where to write those stories to. And so we do have configuration to turn off that particular ability within one and enable it in another. And so you do have to massage those a little bit. Whereas if you're using the published one on Chromatic, we take care of all that for you.
But you can also compose another local storybook in, and then only have one MCP server that just composes the other one.
Right.
No.
Right. Okay. Um, get to that. Okay. So now it's going to, so it did some like state management stuff. It built some components and now it's adding the stories. And so we can see here, it's added this delivery time selector. It shows some rather interesting colors, which honestly, that's because I forced it to so that we could demo part of the workflow here. So it's still updating. So it created some new stories for this new component, and then it's updating existing stories to also use it and test for it.
So is this all still within your one prompt at the beginning, or have
Yeah, this
you?
is still one shot. I haven't given any
Okay,
input aside from, I think in the beginning I had to allow it to do something.
right. Okay.
Kai, could you share your
Yes.
initial prompt which you were using?
Do you want me to share the plan? Because the prompt was just do this plan.
Okay. Okay. All right.
I'll share the plan at the end. That'll
Okay.
that'll take a
Thank
little
you.
bit. Oh, I have some path issues on my local machine. So it has to do some funky things in the terminal. So it looks like first it's going to check the types, and then it's going to run the stories. So yeah, I found like an unused import or something. Okay, so types look good. So now it's going to run the story test. And that is another thing that the MCP allows is, whoops, it's kind of hard to scroll in here. So it's got this run story test tool that allows it to not just run the component tests here, but do it for a particular set of tests. All right, so it found a failing test, and so it's going to fix it. Notice I haven't typed anything. This is all just, it's on its own. And by the way, notice that when it ran those tests, it also updated the Storybook UI. That's something pretty unique to our MCP server that we'll talk about later. Okay, so it fixed the test, but it also found an accessibility issue. Go figure. And it's asking me because it can't really know for sure how to fix that issue because it's a color contrast issue and that has like design and subjective elements to it. So it's like there's one remaining issue. Oh, it's actually the red error text. So let me go to the validation errors. Should I darken the error text color or leave it as is? So I'm going to say darken the color. Did it already do it? Well, let me run these tests. Yeah, looks like it already did it. Okay. So yeah, that was kind of the full demo. Did it ever? I don't know that it ever called docs to look up component information. I wonder why it didn't. Well, it's done it when I ran this in the past. I guess something about the way I executed this plan, it didn't feel like it needed other components. Um, yeah,
What did it
that's
do
kind
then?
of
Did it
weird.
do the so it did the testing though, right?
It did the testing.
Okay.
It just didn't pull in, it didn't look up information about existing components.
All right.
I'm not sure why. That's the fun with these AI agents is they never do the same thing, the exact same thing twice.
For sure. Like taking
Okay.
the demo bit even more worse, I guess.
Yeah. Um, Let me stop sharing my screen and now we'll look up some more questions. Um,
Yeah, Kyle, I have a relevant one here. So
Go
can the
ahead.
MCP help you to get a component story or documentation so I can implement it in my own project? So essentially the question is, how can the MCP leverage existing design systems so that I can create new components?
So they want to create components in the design system, and they're asking,
No, they
can
want to
you,
use a component library, right? And how can the
okay.
MCP help them to compose new components?
Right. So if the design system is using Storybook and has published a Storybook with the new manifest option that's in Storybook 10.3, then the Storybook MCP server will be able to connect to that and pull in all the information it needs to use the design system's components. But it can't connect to any design system that doesn't use Storybook or uses an old version of Storybook. It's not like a general I understand UI thing. It understands storybooks. Maybe I don't. I hope that answered the.
Okay. Um, is there capability to use framework agnostic components in the NCP in the roadmap? And if so, any idea when? It's a question from Bree. This might be a good opportunity to talk about. So yes, it's React only right now. Um, yeah, but do you want to talk about like why we did that and kind of what
Absolutely.
our plans are for going beyond that?
Yes, because it's not because we don't like the other frameworks at all. The reason we're starting with React is to manage our resources. So essentially, what we have released now is sort of a preview release, not because it's buggy, but just because like we're not entirely sure that it solves everyone's problems yet. So we're hoping to get a lot of feedback from everyone, or at least like from React users, of course. And then maybe based on this feedback, we need to change course. We need to do some radical changes to match what people's workflows are. And if we were to build this and release this for 5 or 6 frameworks, then changing course would be really hard because we would have to change 5 times the amount of code than just saying, oh, we need to diverge a little on the React bit. And then once we've hit the target, we can actually start implementing the other support for the other frameworks because we feel like it's good at that point. And so the plan is definitely to expand support to the other core frameworks within this year. ASAP, maybe we will not get any feedback that requires a lot of work, then we can do it soon. Maybe we need to do a lot of changing before we can invest into the other frameworks. So that's essentially why we're doing this way. You can think of the React users as guinea pigs, just a lot of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but there's another good question for you from Israel. Rather than read it out loud, I'll let you read it and then,
Is it about the Storybook MCP library?
yeah.
Yeah, okay. So my use case is using add Storybook MCP library as an API. And so this is something we've been talking about before, where maybe you have your own MCP server that at that and you don't want to add Storybook to it. We've heard from companies that has like a my specific company MCP server, and then that just has a lot of information. And then the Storybook would be just part of that MCP server. And the way we have architected this is that there are 2 packages. There's the at storybook slash add-on MCP that most people will be using. And then there's a sub package, which is more low level called storybook slash MCP. And they're both public and they're both something that people should use. The lower level package is meant for you, everyone out there, to compose the tools into your own MCP servers. And so there's a create Storybook MCP handler function, which just gives you the whole server, and then you can do whatever you want with it. You can register more tools to the server, or you can add some callbacks and such. And that works for a lot of people that want to modify it. You just essentially have to tell it where can it find the manifests, and then it will do the rest for you with registering the tools and such. If you need even more granularity, you need more customization. Each specific tool in the documentation bit is exported as add list documentation tool, add get story documentation tool, add whatever. Like, so these functions you would call on your existing MCP server to add the Storybook MCP tools to your MCP server. It's a bit hard to mouth block how this API works in a webinar, but essentially it's for the people that really have their own MCP server and they want to add Storybook in. They will add the Storybook tools individually, so they should use that instead. And that will enable you to essentially do whatever you want with it. And that's also what we're using behind the scenes. So it's not like it's it it's not going to break or anything, because if that broke, it will break everything. Um, it's the core of our work here. Um, Noranda asks, how do you point the MCP to a design system storybook that is not directly connected? I think maybe there's different ways to interpret that question. If you're talking about connected, maybe it's not composed into your existing local storybook. And so the what we recommend everyone is to compose it in, because then the storybook add-on MCP takes care of directing the agent to the right design systems that you've composed into your storybook. But if you can't do that or won't do that for whatever reason, then host your design system storybook on Chromatic, because Chromatic does all the MCP handling for you. So you can just add the Chromatic MCP server directly to your agent setup, and that will have all the tools necessary without you messing with your local storybook. And this is also how you will share like if you are a design system author, you're using Storybook, you want to share the MCP capabilities with your company, with some teams that are not using Storybook, you can just host it on Chromatic and they can just connect to that MCP server. They don't have to be using Storybook at all. They just have to be using your design system. And uh, and then or self-hosted in using the API that I just described before. But the Chromatic hosting is free. Uh, so that sounds easy. Yeah.
Michael has a question about, does the Storybook MCP enable agents to verify changes similar to Chrome DevTool MCP? Yes, we have something similar in place, but there are some caveats. So you have to have add-on vtest installed, which is an add-on which provides you some testing capabilities in Storybook's manager, but also it extends your vtest test suite by transforming stories into tests. And Storybook's MCP can actually leverage it to kickstart also a self-healing workflow if you are, for example, working on a new on new components and the first shot of your agent was just not successful. There are some rough edges, or maybe even accessibility failures are popping up, and Storybook's MCP is capable to call the add-on vtest transformations in the background to verify whether your story is correctly rendered or not, and whether it even has accessibility issues or not.
Right. So one thing that it does, which relates to the actual question, currently it doesn't tell the agent what specifically has been rendered in the DOM, or what the styling are, or it doesn't even give the agent a screenshot yet. What it does is that it enables the agent to render the story. Well, the MCP renders the story for it, and then get any test results back or render errors back. But in the future, we're hoping to expanding it with also getting DOM snapshots back and CSS styles. And this is the screenshot of what was actually rendered and all that information about a specific story that the agent can then use to more closely debug what's going on without having to write tests or assertions if it doesn't want to, for whatever reason.
A question from Steve. Yep, I think you can answer that. Our docs inject archetypes at runtime for our stories. Pulling the docs via MCP does not inject the archetypes. As far as I know, we do a lot of static analysis, so dynamically extracting information is a bit hard, but maybe you can answer that.
Yeah, so that's definitely one of the limitations we have for now, but it's also one of the things that we are very eager to look into, which is essentially that the MCP prop type extraction is specifically on the component and not referencing anything that you customize with the archetypes. But we want to solve that as well, and we need to soon. So right now you can't customize it with the archetypes, but that's not a limitation that we are happy with. So there will be some sort of solution to that problem coming for sure.
Yeah. Steve had another question that I thought was really great.
Mhm.
He says some of our components have lots of tests. When we pull the document for a component, it returns all the tests as part of the documents. In components with many tests, for that's a lot of wasted context. So do we plan on separating docs, props, and tests so that we can control what level of details we want?
So it sounds, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but otherwise it sounds like Steve has been using one of the older versions of add-on MCP because we've actually solved that already. And when I say we, that was specifically Valentine that solved that, where we are now defaulting to only having the top three stories as part of the documentation result that gets back to the agent, specifically to not bloat the context completely. That was not what happened in the earlier versions, but that's what happens today. So maybe Steve needs to update, or maybe there's something else going on. Then the agent has the option to fetch the rest of the stories if it's things that it needs more context. There's like a use case that it needs to know more about. But it's only the top three stories that are part of a component's default documentation.
Okay. Let's see. Valentine, do you want to talk about a little more specifics on the story writing instructions? Naranda is
Yes.
specifically asking around,
Yeah.
does it have guidance on how to correctly use find by, mocking dates, animation
Right.
support?
Right. Yeah, let's talk about it. So, Storybooks MCP has a couple of so-called tools set up in the background. And one of these tools are actually instructions which we send to the agent of how to write, for example, stories. These instructions are necessary since usually the whole test or the whole data which was fed into a model has a cutoff date, and maybe that cutoff date is half a year old, but it doesn't contain actually new APIs of Storybook 10. So one part of these building instructions is, well, how to write actually stories or modern stories with Storybook 10 by also taking into consideration new CSF formats and stuff like that. Um, to answer your question about, well, best practices, I think, and Jeppe, please correct me if I'm wrong, but Storybook never was very strongly opinionated about how you should write your tests. I think we are very open and we don't have a strong opinion of using find by instead of uh, other kind of query types related to testing library assertions. And therefore, I think if you have a best practices applied team or even company wise, it makes sense to just add them to your agent's MD file, which the agent will then just pick up in every kind of session. I'm not sure whether we should enhance our building instructions by setting, I don't know, these 10 recommendations are the best by writing stories. Maybe Jeppe has a different opinion about that.
No, I think one thing that we have landed on at least is that assertions on the DOM are very often not necessary, especially if you have visual regression testing. Uh, the button content, what the text is, might not be useful if you're taking a snapshot of it anyway. So those things have been helpful for us in like cutting down our test complexity, but mostly it's up to the people how you want to write the test. We really like doing the steps bit as well because you can have these steps in Storybook where you explain what's going on here, and that little string that is looking for this content length or whatever, that also helps the agent in understanding why you wrote this assertion or whatever. So that's also useful. It's like a comment that is actually part of the runtime as well.
Cool. I saw a question asking how the storybook instructions tool is different from a skill. And I thought that would be a good chance for us to discuss how we think about MCP server versus skills and what we're
I
doing
mean,
there.
it's a great question. And so for full transparency, that tool was built before skills was a thing, before we had any of that, and so that's why it is this way today. What we have found, though, as with this tool, is that okay, for full context, it's a tool that has the description to the agent that is like. Uh, get information from this tool when you need to do UI work, essentially. And then it just returns some instructions to the agent on how to write stories effectively and what kind of APIs to use. And it could have been a skill. It can still be a skill. We might change it in the future. What's powerful about the current setup is that it pulls information directly from the Storybook runtime. So the text, the instructions that are returned matches your Storybook setup. So it says specifically import from Storybook slash React Vite if you're in a React Vite project, or Next.js if it's a Next.js project, or so on. And it sees that, hey, this person has add-on vtest installed, so it adds more instructions on how to use add-on vtest correctly. Or there's also add-on accessibility, and so we do dynamic instruction generation essentially based on the storybook that has been set up. And that is a bit harder to do with a skill, which is more um, static. It can be done if the skill is ask this CLI to get information about how to use Storybook. We could have done that, and we might still do that. But for now, it's a tool. It is very effective in the evals that we're running internally at really just instructing the agent to how to use Storybook and write stories correctly. But we are also eager to get feedback from users on how they are experiencing it and if they think it made more sense with a CLI or a skill or whatever instead, because we might change course here.
A design token question, Jeppe, about we use a Storybook add-on for tokens. Will this MCP ensure that components use defined tokens for color, sizing, etc.? There are multiple questions about design system tokens. Yeah.
I mean, those are great questions, and we are asking those questions ourselves already. Um, and so I can talk about what we have today and then what we might have in the future. Because today we pull all your MDX documentation into the MCP as well. And so if you put in design token documentation into your MDX files, they will also be available to the agent. When you write either stories or components or specific MDX files, you can put this summary tag in there, which is essentially a line of text or a sentence that you will use to tell the agent why this piece of documentation is important, and which will hopefully make it read those instructions better, right? So if you do have an MDX file that documents your design tokens. Then what you will put in the summary is always read this specific document when you are doing work that requires token usage, and then that will get the agent into the habit of uh, pulling in those instructions every time that it needs to. It's not perfect. I mean, agents are not perfect. They don't always do what you do. And so we are looking into a future where Storybook has first-class support for design tokens, not only on the MCP side or agent side, but also in the Storybook UI. And how that looks like and what the APIs for that we haven't decided on yet, but there is definitely a high demand for better integration with design tokens in Storybook, and potentially we will be doing that soon to solve this pain point. So you don't have to manually write your MDX, but potentially Storybook will pull in the design token documentation automatically and surface it more efficiently for the agent. That was a long answer.
Um,
Eric has a question about, oh, sorry. Yeah. Eric has a question about integrating Storybook into MCP apps. Actually, we wanted to demo that today, but unfortunately, Kai ran out of Copilot credits. So,
yeah.
so we are able to detect whether your agent supports MCP apps, and if so, then after you prompted your agent to build certain stories or component with stories, we actually show a preview of your story in your agent's chat window, more or less, so that you can see your component directly, even without visiting Storybook.
Yeah.
And we plan to extend MCP app support also for future MCP development.
I
Yeah,
think
that's a really nice workflow.
maybe Kyle has a recording of that we can share, where it actually
That's actually
works
exactly what I'm doing.
with Copilot, because it's
Yes.
a pretty great experience. Um,
Yeah. So I'm going to put that in the chat. It's nice. So what I showed was having like a storybook open side by side, which makes sense in a live demo. Like it's neat to watch it kick tests off and stuff like that. But realistically, you're probably kicking off an agent and you're doing something else until the agent tells you that it's done. And that preview allows you to just come back at the end and see embedded stories right there in the chat. You don't even have to open a browser. It's really great. So yeah, I shared the YouTube link for our most previous webinar, where I basically did the same workflow here, but the demo, frankly, went a little bit smoother. And so it might be a better demonstration of what the MCP server can actually do. And it does use VS Code, and so you do see the story previews. On that note, there's a couple questions that say people are missing kind of the big picture, like who are the MCP server, who's it for? Um, so I apologize for not explaining that very well. Let me take a second stab here. Um, so the MCP server, I'd say primarily is for people that want to generate UI using components that are in a storybook. That's the primary use case. Um, and you get that whether you're using it locally or whether you're using like a published one on Chromatic. Um, Beyond that, if you're developing UI inside of an app or wherever that has a storybook itself, then that MCP server can help you write stories, test stories, and preview those stories. And so it's for really any developer that's generating UI with agents. Like it'll be helpful in just about any workflow, I think. Is there anything you two would add to that?
I think maybe a slightly future-looking aspect of that is well, Storybook has always been about component-driven development, about looking at your components in isolation instead of looking at your whole page, right? And a lot of the front end and UI space is with agents is working on reviewing your application, and you make Claude code, write some UI, and then you see the application, right? Whereas in the Storybook team, we've always known that, well, you want to look at each specific component in isolation. And so that's really what we want to to make people or help people do here is get the agent to work on a component in isolation and review it in isolation as well. So in the future, we will probably also come up with tools that makes it easier for you to review the work. So not only just here's the story that it outputted, but also allow you to comment on specific items within the story and give feedback to the agent directly in Storybook or in the chat about the stories. Because well, we talk a lot about stories here because it's a storybook, but it's really just about an isolated component and the workflow really where the agent does some work to your UI and then you say, hey, these four things are bad. The border on this button is bad or whatever. And then the agent does another iteration and then it runs tests again and so on. That's where we want to get to, really. Not just Storybook as a building tool, but also as a review tool for your components. I'm not sure I even clarified anything here, other than just talked about the future.
Well, that's exciting too.
Right.
By the way, I'm saving it for the very end, but we will be discussing like what's next in terms of
Sure.
Storybook and AI integrations.
Steve Thomas writes that the MCP has been huge in their agentic workflows. So thank you. That is nice to hear.
Yeah. Um, Somebody's asking if there's any security issues that should be noted about using this feature.
I don't think so, because we're not exposing anything that you would not already be exposing in your storybook. Um, so like if you're hosting your storybook online today, you are sharing stories and you're sharing snippets of source code in those stories so that people can see how your button is written. And it's the exact same thing that we're just sharing in a more efficient way with your agent. So that's the same, I guess, security concern. Um, I'm not. I can't come up with right now a security concern specifically with Storybook MCP, at least.
I couldn't either. That's why I asked the expert.
Yeah.
Mm. All right. Here's a good one. While building this out, did you discover any changes to your thinking or architecture as to what made good stories, or what worked better for agents compared to humans reading the documentation?
A lot. I'm just trying to compress it.
So I think we can differentiate here. So the first use case is you have your storybook in your repository, your design system in your repository, and you use agents to create new components based on the components and stories you already have. In this case, usually the context window of agents is also polluted pretty fast by looking up your whole file system and figuring out things and stuff like that. And Storybooks MCP can just give you the information much quicker and in a more condensed way, so that our learning was that agents are more likely to solve a specific task with their first attempt. And I think if we talk about integrating design systems which are not in your repository but installed via node modules into your project and building new components by composing these design system components, it's even harder for agents to figure things out like documentation. MDX documentation is not published with these node modules, so it's it just really leverages your agent to do its job and to not hallucinate that much. And I think that was really the biggest learning for us of how could we how could we create a tool which not replaces an agent's capability to look up things, but rather being a good kind of co-worker to provide information in a condensed way and to just save the context window so that it's more likely to not hallucinate and produce a good outcome.
I think yeah, um I think also uh the documentation tooling that we're providing for this MCP work has been the same always. Like it's all based on writing JS doc comments above your stories, writing JS doc comments above your components. And we've been able to do that in Storybook at least since Storybook 7, but maybe also before that. Um, but not many people have been using that capability because it wasn't really necessary to document to a human what this specific story was about or why this was important. But it actually, we found that it does make a lot of sense to agents to say, to think of these stories as use case demos and say, this specific story, you should read this story, you should understand the story when you need to up a custom template or whatever, right? Like really just documenting stories with the comments is very valuable to agents, not necessarily as much for humans. Um, so I will expect that we will see that a lot more in the future. People writing comments on their stories and on the components more explicitly for agents to get that information. That was another learning that we had.
There are several questions about how Storybook MCP works along with Figma MCP and whether it helps to validate stories and to match the Figma props and styles. So I think to summarize it and what the manifest JSON more or less is, it's a composition of two files of the components JSON and the docs JSON. The components JSON file contains more or less a streamlined kind of meta information of all of your components, like title, summary, and description of one of the component, properties and description of the properties and which kind of stories it has. And then the docs JSON contains all information of unattached MDX documentation. What it doesn't contain is actually rendered HTML with CSS, right? So I'm not sure how MCP could help our MCP could help in combination with the Figma MCP. I think the Figma MCP is valuable, but not necessarily in that combination, figuring out whether one component matches the design in a Figma file or frame.
No, I don't think
Yeah,
for
I'll
that
expand on
specific.
that.
Oh, okay, go ahead, Kyle.
I'm just going to say we're still investigating that workflow and how they should best work together. And that'll be a future webinar. Like we're really interested in figuring that out. We just haven't been able to dedicate the right time to it yet.
Yeah. Uh, I agree with Valentin that it's not necessarily about ensuring that it's a one-to-one pixel match with Figma, but there's definitely a workflow there where you use the Figma MCP to inform the agent on what UI it should build, and then it builds that with stories so that it can test and validate that it actually has built the thing, and that it works with hover and all the jazz that's more than just a static image. Um, so I definitely see them being combined, but we're still investigating. Um, there's a technical comment by Frederick. Is the component manifest will it streamline with the custom element manifests from web components? And it was heavily inspired by it. And once we get to implement support for custom elements, so not just React, then we will most likely be integrating with custom element manifest for sure, because it's already there. So yeah.
It's a question from Michael about, would you rather have the AI document the components or do it yourself? Have you found that one approach works better for the agents in the end? I thought that was an interesting question of like, would agents be able to better understand something that's written by another agent?
So I don't think there's a one answer to that question. We definitely haven't found it at least, but I approach it similar to how I approach any other coding with an agent, saying it does the first draft of documentation. And there are even great articles out there that really tells you how you should be documenting for an agent. Point it towards that. Ask it to write documentation for your component, and then you expect that it did it like 80%, and then you need to do the last 20% yourself, cleaning it up, making it a bit shorter, uh, fixing up some mistakes that it did. Definitely, there's an interesting workflow where you uh, you do this with sub-agents. If you have 100 components, you don't want one agent to document all 100 components because the context window is going to be completely broken. So tell it to do one component with one sub-agent so they don't pollute each other, and you'll get way better results for sure. But we're also diving into this more in the future. What is the actual best way to write documentation for agents? Which unfortunately is a very moving target. Like in a year, the model is going to be different, and so the way you write stuff is also probably going to be different. But what can you do?
There is a follow-up question about, have you found that there are best practices for writing stories that improve the output for agents using the MCP? So we have actually a manifest debugger where you can just start and take a look into which kind of stories would be best suitable for agents by going through some heuristics. Jeppe, maybe you can talk about these heuristics.
I mean, so where you figure out how to get stories into the manifest or not?
Yeah, I mean, often we just can't get them in because, for example, the CSF, the component story format is just wrong, or maybe the user uses some templates or whatsoever which we cannot recognize, and the debugger helps you to figure out these cases and to correct them.
Exactly. So maybe what something we haven't touched on explicitly here is that the MCP knowledge is based on what we call a manifest, which is this JSON file that is generated from all your stories. And when we generate this JSON file for you, as Valentin says, we can't cover all the different ways that you people out there define your stories. Like if you do destructuring of story A and B together to create a new story C that is then created dynamically by running some other function over here, whatever. We can't analyze that for the manifest part. So we throw you an error in the manifest debugger saying we can't include this story in the manifest. And then we give you guidelines on you should probably just write your stories more plainly, more basic, similar to what we have in our documentation. I think uh, I think maybe I understood the question slightly differently. So I wanted to touch that on that is that what you must understand also is that it's not just about stories, it's also about getting the prop types of components into the MCP. And we get that today. And the agents are great with prop types. Stories add like an additional layer of use cases. And one thing that prop types really can't express is when you have composing components. So if you use this composition way to build your UI where you must put in an accordion title component, and then that has to have like an accordion details, where like so you compose different components together. You can't express that with prop types, so write stories for that, so that the agent understands how can it effectively combine components in your design system. That's one thing that we've been very focused on for stories that you can't get from prop types alone.
All right, I think we have time for one last question, and then I'm going to steal the stage again to tease what's coming next.
Cool.
So was there one that really piqued your interest? If you don't have one, I'll do this one. So Brian asks, have you seen cases where MCP actually hurts outcomes because example-heavy docs anchor the model away from its correct training knowledge? If so, is there a plan to surface critical patterns separately from stories to avoid that?
Yes and yes. So one thing that we've heard from a user was that they were using a public design system, that was in fact already in the training data of the model. Um, but when it added the MCP server for that design system, it would confuse the model because it already had training data. So what should it do with this extra information? This is rare to see in like company design systems, which are usually private, so they're not part of any training data. So I wouldn't care too much about that. But that's at least one thing where we've seen that it can be a problem when you have training data that is not the same as what the MCP does live. And we have also been discussing a lot about giving users the possibility to say this specific document, this MDX, or this comment is super important for the agent to understand. So you must force inject it into the context somehow. We have played around with different ways to do that. It could also be a lot of storybooks have like these getting started documentations that are like when you're using this design system, you must be adhering to these four rules or whatever, and then giving users a way to say this is critical information. You must inject that into the agent, and we are exploring that for sure.
Yep. All right. Brian says he is that guy. He's in the early access program.
Cool.
That's perfect. Okay. As I promised, let's end with a teaser here. So I'm gonna share my screen once again. Um, there it is. Oh boy. Okay. So what's next for Storybook and AI agents? We have a number of projects that we have planned, or honestly, we've already started working on some of these. So um, first time we talked about this before, we are definitely going to support the other kind of core official frameworks. So web components, Vue, Svelte, and Angular. Um, the community and ourselves and some experiments, we've even already started in some of these. Um, yeah, it's definitely planned. Second, I don't know if you were paying close attention. As we all watched the agent do the work, I navigated myself in Storybook to the component that was generated in the stories. That's because I had already run this demo. I knew what was coming. We'd really like to highlight in Storybook what stories are new, which ones are changed, and just kind of give you a better workflow and review experience there. And so we've already got some really promising work going on that, and hopefully we'll be able to show you something soon. Um, Probably the most common feedback we get about Storybook in general is how hard it is and how just kind of convoluted it can be to set it up in a new project. And so we're looking to use agents to help with that as well. Um, got some pretty promising results already on that one too. So these three we've already started work on. Actually, these four. So that manifest that we've been talking about, where it pulls in all the information from your components and exposes it to agents, that relies on one of two libraries, either React DocGen or React DocGen TypeScript. And the first one is really fast, but not necessarily comprehensive. And the second one is much more comprehensive, but also much slower. And we were not happy with those trade-offs. And so based on the Volar library, which is what Vue component meta uses, we made our own, which is, I don't know that we've released that yet. It'll be released experimentally first, but we're calling it React component meta. And in our benchmarks, it is significantly both faster and more comprehensive in terms
It
of
is
what it
part of
extracts.
the recent pre-releases of 10.4.
Oh, so
So
it is out
people,
in the
yeah,
alpha?
yeah,
Okay, cool. And it's behind the feature flag, right?
yeah.
Okay. Um, and then finally, as we discussed, when we started this work, skills weren't really a thing yet, and they've since exploded. And so we're always interested in using the best tool for the best job. And so we're exploring how skills can play into these workflows and more. So that's what's coming. And yeah, I guess four of those have active work behind them already. if not a release. So that's our webinar for today. Thank you so much to everybody for joining us, and especially for all of your questions. We actually got more than we could get through, which is best possible scenario. So thanks for being so engaged. Jeppe and Valentin, thanks especially for joining us with your expertise and sharing what we've learned. And yeah,
It was fun. I wish we had
Indeed.
2 hours more because lots of great questions.